Who is the Queen of Heaven? She received incense in the streets of Jerusalem, offerings on the hills of Judah, devotion within the homes of the people of God, not by mistake, not by ignorance. The people themselves knew what they were doing, and when God commanded them to stop, they answered that they would not. She was worshipped in empires that never communicated with one another, with the same face, the same rights, the same titles, in languages that never crossed paths. She promised abundance, answered offerings, protected families, and the people who worshipped her had enough evidence to defend that choice before a prophet. Her name changed according to the people who worshipped her. And she did not remain in the past. The last book of the Bible describes her still standing, still seducing, and this time with the whole world at her feet. Jeremiah stood before a multitude that had already heard everything. The words of the Lord had come with clarity and with weight. The prophet had spoken of abandonment, of consequence, of the thread that still existed between that people and the God who had brought them out of Egypt. The answer came organized, firm, almost with the confidence of those who had thought well before speaking. The people said they would continue doing everything they had promised to do. They would continue burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. They would continue pouring out drink offerings in her honor, exactly as they, their fathers, and their kings had done in the cities of Judah. Jeremiah chapter 44, verse 17 records the words with a precision that disturbs. The people mentioned the fathers. He mentioned the kings, mentioned the cities as those who describe a legitimate inheritance. There were entire generations within that speech. A tradition with roots deep enough that no one there felt astray. What makes this moment different from any other spiritual crisis in Israel is that the people knew exactly what they were doing and chose to defend that choice. In the previous episodes of idolatry in the Old Testament, there was always some element of outward seduction, of a king who introduced a cult, of a neighboring people who exerted pressure, of a generation that grew up without instruction. But in Jeremiah chapter 44, the people speak for themselves without intermediary, without visible coercion, with full clarity about what they are choosing and whom they are opposing. And what draws the attention of any careful reading is the distribution of the right among the families. Each member had a function within the practice, like gears in a well-ordered system. The children went out to gather wood. The men kept the fire burning. The women worked the dough with their hands to prepare the offerings. This division of tasks does not arise spontaneously in one generation. It is taught, transmitted, reinforced over time with the same seriousness with which a trade is passed on. There were whole families with name, with history, with the weight of the covenant engraved in the collective memory, and yet participating together in a worship directed to an entity the Lord had forbidden. What seizes the mind in this account is the absence of visible inward conflict, and the people of Jeremiah 44 speak with conviction, with no signs of doubt, with no hesitation. When someone defends a practice with this level of firmness in the presence of a prophet, the bond with that practice has already passed from the realm of habit into the realm of identity. To abandon the Queen of Heaven for that people would be to abandon part of themselves. It would be to break with something that had shaped the life of the family for decades. And it is this weight that Jeremiah carries when he writes the account. He is not describing a momentary apostasy. He is describing a loyalty built layer upon layer. The worship had structure, had collective participation, had its own language, and had a force of cohesion that resisted even the direct word of the Lord. There remains, then, and the question that the text itself raises without needing to frame it. What entity could generate this level of devotion in a people who knew the name of the true God? What did she offer that weighed this much, that held whole families even when the consequence of turning away from God was visible in the history of Israel? The answer was not in the title the people used for her. It was in what that title concealed, in centuries of presence, of promise, and of result. The fire was already burning when the women began the work with the dough. Their hands shaped the cakes with a precision that came from custom, from the gesture repeated until it became muscle memory. The final product had a defined, recognizable form, one that any member of the family would know how to identify. They were the kawanan, ritual offerings with a specific shape, intended exclusively for the Queen of Heaven. The word kawanan appears in the Hebrew text of Jeremiah with a weight that translation usually softens. It describes a sacred object, laden with intention, produced for an end that goes beyond nourishment. The shape of these offerings was molded in the likeness of the entity being worshipped, with features that represented her. The hands that shaped the dough knew what they were doing, knew for whom they were shaping it. There was a complete vocabulary in that gesture, a language without words between the worshiper and the one worshipped, and that vocabulary was taught within the home, passed from woman to woman, from generation to generation, and the fire that the men kept burning served as an improvised altar in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. The wood that the children gathered fed that altar with the same regularity with which a household hearth is fed. What was formed there was a chain of devotion distributed throughout the whole family structure, where each age group contributed what it had, making the rite collective and continual. This kind of cultic organization reveals something that goes beyond ordinary religious behavior. When a system distributes sacred functions by age and gender, it is creating bonds of belonging that cross generations. The child who gathers the wood grows up knowing that he contributed to the rite from an early age, and the man who keeps the fire feels the weight of a responsibility inherited from the father who did the same before him. The woman who shapes the kawanan carries in her hands a knowledge she received from her mother, who received it from hers, in a chain of transmission that the text of Jeremiah records without ornament, with the coldness of one who documents what he saw. The prophet describes all this with details that make the account disturbing to read with attention. For the more the reader sees the structure, the more he perceives that it had the solidity of sacred tradition. It had its own material, had a ritual product with technical specificity, had a division of roles, had regularity, had the adherence of the whole family as a complete devotional unit. And a system with this level of inward cohesion does not survive by the force of imposition. It survives because it delivers something people feel as real, as necessary, as protective. The people of Judah maintained that worship with genuine zeal, with the kind of care devoted to what is valued. And what fed that care, what justified so much collective effort, was in the origin of that practice. A rite so structured as this carries within it a history far longer than any family there could retell. It had reached those hands already formed, already endowed with language, already with name and form. And the name it bore was far older than Israel, far older than any memory the people of Judah could reach by looking back. And the title that the people of Judah spoke with such familiarity had versions spread through civilizations that had never exchanged a single word with one another. In Babylon, the name was Ishtar. In Sumer, the older figure received the name Inanna. Among the Phoenicians and the peoples of Canaan, the same being was called Astaroth. Each culture had its own language, its own symbols, its own way of representing this presence. But the attributes repeated themselves with a consistency that defies any explanation of cultural coincidence. The association with the planet Venus appears in all these records, among peoples separated by millennia and by continents. The role of lady of fertility, of war, and of physical love also repeats itself without significant variation. The rites of lamentation, the songs in the night, the offerings with specific forms, the female figure crowned with stars, all of this resurfaces in each tradition with a faithfulness that suggests a common source, earlier than all of them. Israel had arrived in Canaan and found Astaroth already established upon the local altars, with temples, with priests, with a base of worshippers formed over the course of centuries. contact with this worship was gradual. The texts of the book of Judges record that the people forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroths, placing the two names together as though they were one system. The Queen of Heaven, whom Jeremiah confronts in his time, had already passed through centuries of infiltration into Israel, through cycles of adoption, abandonment, and return that crossed the period of the judges, the kings, and the prophets. In each generation that returned to the worship carried a version slightly adapted to the local context, but with the core preserved: the celestial female figure, the promise of abundance, the organized family devotion. The geographic reach of this system is what weighs most heavily when one looks upon the map of ancient civilizations. From the eastern Mediterranean unto Mesopotamia, from the Phoenician coast unto the valleys of Anatolia, the same entity received offerings. There was no trade route broad enough to explain so deep a uniformity of attributes. The pattern was too great to have been born from simple cultural borrowing among neighboring peoples. And what Israel faced, therefore, was a spiritual system of global dimension, and with roots that went far beyond the influence of the peoples around Canaan. Then when the women of Judah shaped the Kawanan with their hands, they were taking part in a rite that women in Nineveh, in Ur, and in Byblos had practiced with the same gestures centuries before. The form was the same because the origin was the same, transmitted through cultures like a current that no geographic boundary had been able to interrupt. The name changed according to the language of the people who worshipped, but the essence remained intact, as though the being behind all these titles had an interest in being recognized in every place. And the fact that Israel knew the God who had parted the Red Sea, who had spoken from Sinai, who had sustained the people in the wilderness for 40 years, makes adherence to this system even heavier to understand. What did this entity of such vast reach promise to deliver that the Lord, it in the eyes of that people, seemed not to be delivering? The answer was in the very words that the people of Judah left recorded, and they changed the way of seeing everything. The people of Judah did not ask forgiveness when Jeremiah finished speaking. They presented an argument with the firmness of those who build a case upon lived experience. The words are preserved in Jeremiah chapter 44, verses 17 and 18, and they carry a weight that hurried reading cannot absorb with integrity. The people said that in the days when they burned incense to the Queen of Heaven, there was abundance in their houses. The families had bread. The fields answered. Life had a stability that they were able to feel. When they stopped, under pressure from the reforming kings who tried to root out the worship, scarcity came, war drew near, and daily life collapsed in ways they were able to recount. The connection they made between abandoning the right and the deterioration of living conditions was concrete enough to sustain an argument before a prophet. Jeremiah is not before people who worship through empty tradition or through fear of something unknown. He is before people with a memory of results, with personal evidence gathered over the course of years. And this is the most disturbing layer of the whole account, because the deception that works upon real experience possesses a force that deception based on future promise never reaches. When someone can point to a concrete period of his own life and say that in that time there was abundance, the abstract theology of a prophet weighs less than the memory of the full storehouse, and the mechanism behind this lies in how the human being processes causality. The mind tends to bind the result to the most recent and visible action that came before it. If the period of devotion to the Queen of Heaven coincided with political stability and sufficient harvests, memory records that connection with the solidity of a proven fact. What memory rarely records with the same clarity is what was happening spiritually during that same period of apparent prosperity. What was being yielded, what was being shaped. The prophets who came before Jeremiah described in detail what accompanied that abundance. The erosion of justice, the abandonment of the orphan and the widow, the corruption of the priests, the silence of the altars of the Lord, Material prosperity was being built upon an emptying that physical eyes could not measure with the same ease with which they measured the stock of grain. The worship of the Queen of Heaven offered visible result in the short term with a cost that only became readable decades later, when the spiritual structure of an entire nation had already given way within. The people of Judah who speak with Jeremiah are the final product of this process. Generations of devotion to the system had produced people unable to distinguish blessing from bait. And the most revealing datum lies in the fact that the Lord himself had sustained Israel in periods of faithfulness with an abundance that the texts of Deuteronomy describe with precision. The difference was in the source. The prosperity tied to the covenant carried with it justice, identity, a real protection. What the worship of the Queen delivered was abundance disconnected from any commitment to what man was inwardly. A nation can be fed and be consumed at the same time. The people of Judah were in both processes simultaneously, and only one of them was visible to the naked eye. The argument they presented to Jeremiah was sincere. Their perception was real. And that is exactly why the system worked with such efficiency over entire generations. A deception that produces genuine result on the material plane has the capacity to survive prophetic confrontations, royal reforms, and even the weight of a covenant with the God who parted the sea. And this system, with all its capacity to deliver visible result and to build loyalty upon real experience, was not a structure with one single piece. It had parts that worked together, with distinct and complementary functions. Paul wrote something that seems impossible until the moment you understand what he is describing with technical precision, without metaphor. In the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 11, verse 14, he affirms that Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light, and that his ministers present themselves as ministers of righteousness. The verb used in the original Greek is metaschematizo, which carries the idea of real transformation of appearance, of complete covering, in a form that common human senses cannot penetrate. Paul is describing a capacity for disguise that goes beyond superficial imitation, a spiritual presence that can present itself with the same sensory texture as that which is genuinely sacred. And when this verse is read alongside the argument that the people of Judah presented to Jeremiah, the connection between the two texts reveals the exact mechanism that sustained centuries of devotion to the Queen of Heaven. The entity that received the Kawanan from the hands of the women of Judah presented herself as provider, as a maternal figure of cosmic dimension, as guardian of the households, as a lady who rewarded faithfulness with abundance. Everything that the human being most needs to feel exists over him. Concrete care, protective presence, response to offerings she offered with enough consistency to build loyalty over the course of generations. The worship had an atmosphere of nearness that the rites of the temple, with their demands of purity and their priestly mediations, did not always convey with the same immediacy to the common Israelite. The Queen of Heaven was accessible. Her altars stood in the streets, in the corners of the cities of Judah, upon the hills around Jerusalem, within reach of any family with no need of official intermediary. This cultivated nearness over generations created an emotional bond that transcended the realm of rational belief. The people felt that she answered, that she was present, that she cared for their daily life. And when a spiritual system can produce this sense of response and presence, it begins to compete with true faith upon the hardest ground of all, that of lived, subjective experience. The believer who feels the presence of the Lord in prayer has a solid inward anchor. The idolater who also feels response in his rites possesses an experience that, inwardly, seems equally real. The difference between the two cases lies in something the prophetic texts try to articulate in diverse ways: the origin of what is responding, and the destination of the one being led by that response. Isaiah, Hosea, and Jeremiah describe Israel's relation with the fertility cults with the image of a broken covenant, of a people who exchanged the God who formed them for a presence that seduced them with what they needed to hear. The seduction that works with the greatest depth never presents itself as deviation. It presents itself as the more accessible, nearer, and more responsive version of the sacred. What made the worship of the Queen of Heaven particularly resistant to prophetic correction was exactly this capacity to seem good, to seem caring, to seem on the side of the people. Jeremiah entered the scene with the severity of the word of the Lord, with judgment, with a call to repentance. The queen came with abundance, with presence upon household altars, with the comfort of a familiar family rite. For a common family of Judah, the choice between the two did not present itself as a choice between good and evil. It presented itself as a choice between distant demand and nearness that delivered result. And it is this mechanism that Paul describes with the image of the angel of light. The greatest spiritual danger never comes with the appearance of threat. It comes with the appearance of answer. The Queen of Heaven, whom Israel refused to abandon, worked with such efficiency because each element of her worship had been calibrated to satisfy a legitimate human need. But this entity, with all her capacity to clothe deception with the appearance of the sacred, had around her a structure that the narrative of Israel had not yet fully revealed. The presence of Ashtaroth upon the altars of Israel was never an isolated phenomenon. The texts of the prophets mention her consistently alongside other names as parts of one whole. Baal appears with her in the records of the Book of Kings with a regularity that ceases to be coincidence and becomes the description of a structure, of a spiritual arrangement with an internal division of functions. Baal was the lord of rain, of the fertility of the soil, of the agricultural yield that determined whether a family would eat or go hungry. He covered the economic dimension of existence, the material foundation upon which everything else rested. Molech occupied the opposite extreme of the spectrum, the territory of absolute sacrifice, of irreversible surrender. His altars in the valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, received what was most precious within a family. The book of Jeremiah describes the valley of Hinnom as the place where the people burned their sons in the fire, a practice that the Lord explicitly declared he had never commanded and that had never even entered his mind. And between Baal, who promised sustenance, and Molech, who demanded the utmost in exchange for future security, the Queen of Heaven occupied the center of the system with the function of seduction and effective cohesion. She was the gentle face of the entire structure, the figure that made the whole thing palatable, in that clothed with motherhood and nearness a system that in other parts demanded fire and blood. Together, the three covered every dimension of human anxiety: sustenance, the future, belonging. Each altar answered a different need, and the worshiper who frequented one was naturally led to the others. Entry into the system was rarely abrupt. It began with the most accessible altar, with the gentlest rite, with the most immediate promise, and commitment deepened layer by layer. Jezebel entered Israel by marriage, but what she brought with her was more than the personal religion of a foreign queen. It was the complete infrastructure of the worship, with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Ashtaroth sustained at the royal table. And the book of 1 Kings records these numbers with a specificity that reveals institutional scale. Jezebel financed an entire clergy, turning the worship from a private practice into a structure supported by the state. When the state sponsors a spiritual system, what changes is not only the visibility of the worship, it is the collective perception of legitimacy, of normality, that such a thing is part of the established order of things. The generations that grew up under the reign of Ahab and Jezebel found the altars of Baal and Ashtaroth as part of the permanent landscape of Israel, present before their birth and sustained by royal authority. Elijah confronted this system on Mount Carmel with a scene that the biblical text describes in precise detail. The fire that did not come down upon the altar of the prophets of Baal through all the morning and through all the afternoon, and the fire that came down from the Lord. But the victory of Carmel was followed by Jezebel's threat, by Elijah's retreat into the wilderness, by the prophet's report unto the Lord that he had been left alone, that the altars of the covenant had been destroyed. This detail reveals the weight of the infiltration. Jezebel's system had advanced to the point of leaving the altars of the Lord in ruins while her own sanctuaries remained standing and funded. A structure with this level of organization, with professional clergy, with royal support, and with the affectionate covering of the queen, he had the capacity to recover from any individual prophetic confrontation and to continue shaping generations. And what Jezebel represented within Israel was the human and institutional version of something that had roots far deeper than any Phoenician lineage could explain. The origin of this system preceded Tyre, preceded Canaan, preceded the written records themselves that researchers are able to reach in the oldest layers of the memory of civilizations. Before we continue, if this content has blessed your life, like, comment, and share. Subscribe to the channel, and if you would like to bless the channel, click the Super Thanks button and leave an offering of any amount or become a member. We have also left some products in the description. Acquire one and bless the channel. Continuing, and the oldest written records that researchers have been able to recover do not describe battles, nor kings, nor the borders of empires. They describe Inanna. The celestial female figure appears on the clay tablets of Sumer with attributes already fully formed, with hymns, with titles, with detailed rites. This means that when Abraham departed from Ur of the Chaldeans in obedience to the call of the Lord, the worship of this entity had already accumulated centuries of organized practice in that same city. Israel arose as a nation millennia after these first inscriptions. The Queen of Heaven already had theology, already had liturgy, already had a base of worshippers before Israel existed. The temporal reach of this worship completely changes the way one reads what Jeremiah faced. The prophet was confronting a devotion with roots older than the covenant at Sinai, older than the Exodus. The Sumerian texts of Inanna describe her as Lady of the Me, a set of divine powers that included the priesthood, the descent into the lower world, the knowledge of the celestial cycles, and dominion over war. The association with the planet Venus runs through all these records with remarkable consistency. Venus is the heavenly body that appears as the morning star before the sun and as the evening star after sunset. The priests who observed the sky from the towers of Babylon described Inanna as the one who descends and rises, the one who crosses the boundaries between worlds, the one who has access to dimensions the other gods do not reach. This specific attribute, the ability to move between forbidden spheres, it was a central part of her cultic identity. And the knowledge she supposedly transmitted to her priests was described as revelation of supernatural origin. When the book of Genesis describes the period before the flood, the text records a level of corruption that the Lord judged to be irreversible, as contamination that had penetrated every dimension of creation. Chapter 6 of Genesis mentions beings called Nephilim, a corruption of the created order, and describes that the wickedness of man was great in the earth and that every intent of his heart was continually evil. The flood answered this condition with a radical beginning anew. But the new beginning did not erase memory. And where memory survives, patterns survive with it. The civilizations that emerged after Noah carried fragments of that former world, transmitted by roots that secular history still tries to map without being able to explain fully. The uniformity of the celestial fertility cults among peoples with no contact with one another, which Chapter 3 revealed as a global pattern, finds here its deepest explanation. It is a spiritual system that precedes the nations, that pass through the judgment of the waters by the one route that no flood can block. Transmission within human memory. When Israel bowed before the Queen of Heaven, the people were being reconnected to a pattern that God Himself had judged grave enough to begin the world anew. The gravity of this bond was beyond what any prophet could articulate in words acceptable to an audience that saw only the household rite, the family fire, the cakes shaped by the hands of mothers. In what seemed to be a local religious practice with altars in the streets and offerings on the hills, was the visible surface of an underground current that came from long before Sinai. And the consequence of maintaining this bond, of choosing it with full awareness even before the prophetic warning, did not remain suspended in the air indefinitely. It took shape with a precision that only history can produce. Nebuchadnezzar came unto Jerusalem with an army that the biblical texts describe with the coldness of one recording the inevitable, without ornament, without hesitation. The siege was long. The city resisted with the tenacity of those who still believe that something will change before the end, that a way out will open before total collapse. When the walls gave way, what followed had been recorded beforehand in the warnings of Jeremiah, of Isaiah, of every prophet whom the people had listened to without hearing. The temple was burned. The gold from the altars of the Lord was removed and carried away to Babylon. The priests, the scribes, the craftsmen, the men of ability were taken along. The book of Isaiah, in chapter 46, verses 1 and 2, describes the moment when Bel bowed down and Nebo stooped, the gods of Babylon being carried as a burden upon beasts. The prophet uses the image of gods that must be carried to reveal the nature of what the peoples treated as sovereign protection, a weight upon the shoulders of their own worshippers. The march of the captives of Judah toward Babylon lasted weeks through the Mesopotamian wilderness. In each step led them deeper into the territory of the empire that had consumed whole nations before them. When the column of captives drew near unto Babylon, the city revealed itself in a scale that no inhabitant of Jerusalem had ever seen before. Walls of glazed brick visible from afar. The main entrance of the city was known throughout all the ancient world as one of the constructions most imposing that any civilization had produced unto that moment. The Ishtar Gates, a monumental structure covered with blue and golden tiles decorated with dragons and bulls in relief, dedicated explicitly to the goddess whom Israel had chosen to worship. The name was there engraved in the very architecture of the capital of the empire that had destroyed them, and the people who shaped the Kawanan in honor of the Queen of Heaven passed through the gates that bore her name as captives. The irony was not decorative. It had theological weight that the prophets had tried to articulate for decades without being able to make it visible in the way that moment made it, concretely and irreversibly. Worship defines belonging, and the people who had declared loyalty to the Lady of Babylon were delivered unto Babylon itself to discover what that loyalty truly meant in practice. Within the walls, the captives of Judah found the temples of Ishtar raised with a magnificence that the improvised altars in the streets of Jerusalem had never attained. They found the rites they had known since childhood being practiced on an imperial scale, and with the resources of an entire state dedicated to their maintenance and their grandeur. What had been household worship in Judah was state religion in Babylon, sustained by the same power that now determined every detail of the lives of the exiles. The prophet Daniel, taken young unto Babylon, describes the constant pressure of the imperial system upon the captives, the demand for participation in the rites, for alignment with the spirituality of the conqueror. The Babylon that had imprisoned them demanded of the exiles exactly what the worship of the Queen of Heaven had cultivated in them for generations: devotion to the system, participation in the rites, submission to the structure. What changes between the altars of Judah and the temples of Babylon is only the scale. The logic is the same. The demand is the same. And the cost of resisting had become far more immediate. 70 years of captivity are described in the prophetic texts with nuances that reveal a people being reconfigured within, being forced to discover who they were without the temple, without the land, without the king. And when the decree of Cyrus allowed the return, those who came back carried with them a memory of exile that the following generations preserved with a care that the former period had never produced. The captivity had done what the prophets could not. It had made the cost of the choice visible in a way no word could equal, passing through gates with her name engraved in the stone. But the entity whose name was written upon that architecture did not disappear with the fall of Babylon, and the system survived the empire that had sustained it with greater efficiency than any structure of brick. Centuries after the fall of Babylon, with the Persian Empire already established and Hellenism having swept across the Mediterranean with a speed the former prophets had not foreseen in detail, the Apostle John received on the island of Patmos a vision that the text of Revelation describes with a symbolic density that the scholars of Scripture still explore without exhausting. In chapter 17 of Revelation, a figure appears seated upon many waters, clothed in scarlet and purple, carrying a golden cup full of abominations. Upon her forehead is written a name described in the text as mystery: Babylon the Great, mother of harlotries and of the abominations of the earth. John records that he marveled exceedingly when he saw her, with the Greek verb thaumazo, which describes astonishment before something whose scale and nature exceed what the mind can immediately process. The angel who interprets the vision for John explains that the many waters upon which she sits represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, a scope that leaves no room for a localized reading. What Jeremiah faced in Judah was a worship with deep roots and with regional reach. What John sees in Patmos operates on the scale of civilization, with influence over the totality of the nations. The attributes of the figure of Revelation and those of the Queen of Heaven in Jeremiah do not converge by accident. The golden cup that seduces the kings of the earth carries the same logic as the accessible altars in the streets of Jerusalem. The seduction that works upon rulers and upon multitudes at the same time is an amplification of the same mechanism that worked upon individual families in Judah: the promise of prosperity, of belonging, of response. Revelation describes the kings of the earth who were made drunk with the wine of her harlotry, an image the text uses to describe cultivated dependence, the bond built by perceived benefit. The merchants of the earth who were made rich by her, described in chapter 18, are the global scale version of the argument that the people of Judah presented to Jeremiah. The logic is the same. The system delivers material result, sustains economies, justifies loyalties, and whoever is within it perceives the prosperity far more clearly than he perceives the cost. Chapter 18 of Revelation describes the fall of this structure with a lament that the kings, the merchants, and the sailors pronounce over her as though they had lost the center of everything. They do not lament that they were wrong. They lament the loss of what was profitable unto them, of what sustained them, of what had become so central to existence that its fall seems the end of the world. The people of Judah had said the same thing unto Jeremiah in different words, that since they stopped serving the Queen of Heaven, they had come to lack everything. The history of Israel with the Queen of Heaven seen from this distance has the exact shape of a prophetic pattern, a pattern that the texts of Jeremiah documented at the level of a family shaping cakes in Judah. And Revelation shows the same pattern operating at the level of empires, of trade routes, of systems that cross borders without needing armies to establish themselves. The figure of Revelation seduces with abundance, with position, with the sense that whoever is within the system has access to something that those outside cannot attain, the same argument that the altars of Astaroth cultivated in Canaan. What distinguishes the apocalyptic scene from the scene of Jeremiah is that in Judah there was still a prophet standing. There was still a voice pronouncing the name of the Lord with authority enough to record the refusal of the people. In Revelation, the scale of the seduction is such that John himself marveled, and the angel had to intervene so that he would not interpret the vision in a way that would compromise the understanding of what was being revealed. Verse 9 of chapter 17 records the angel's warning. Here is the understanding that requires wisdom, a phrase the text uses to signal that what is being revealed is not transparent to superficial reading. The system described in Revelation presents itself with the same appearance of legitimacy, of prosperity, of response to human needs that the worship of the Queen of Heaven presented to the families of Judah. The difference lies in the reach and in the moment. Judah was one nation. The apocalyptic scene is the whole world. Judah still had Jeremiah. Revelation describes a seduction of breadth without precedent in human history. Even what John sees in Patmos is not a new entity that arose for the end times. It is the final manifestation of something that the oldest records of human writing had already described upon clay tablets. The same current that came forth from Ur, that passed through Canaan, that entered Israel by the hands of the women who shaped the Kawanan, that marched with the captives through the Ishtar gates, arrived at the final scene with a form that no geographic map can define. For in the end, the greatest deception this system produced through millennia was to convince each generation that it was making a local, household, personal choice with manageable consequences. While the choice was always about who receives the worship, and worship always defined to whom each generation belonged in Judah or in any nation that comes after. And when there is a difference between knowing the history of an ancient people and recognizing that same history at work within one's own life, the altars change form in every generation. The rites receive new names, the systems wear different garments. But the logic remains. Something offers visible result, builds loyalty through experience, and goes on taking the place that belongs to God without ever announcing itself as adversary. It may be work, it may be recognition, it may be relationship, it may be anything that a person has placed at the center of life as the source of security and meaning. The human being was created with a capacity for devotion that does not disappear. It goes somewhere always. The question is where, and it was exactly for this reason that God did not only send prophets, He Himself entered history. I took on flesh, walked among men with a name. Jesus of Nazareth did not come with a system of prosperity, with promises of abundance in exchange for rights, with altars at the corners of cities. He came with a cross, with the weight of everything the human being had chosen instead of God, carried upon His own shoulders, paid for with His own life. What no worship, no spiritual structure, and no promise of abundance had ever been able to offer, He gave freely. Real forgiveness, restored identity, eternal belonging. Not the feeling that someone answers, the certainty that someone died to answer. That is the difference that runs through everything. And if something in this story touched a place within you that you recognize, if there is an altar that you know should not be standing, and if there is a loyalty you have built upon visible result and that has been leaving God farther and farther away without your clearly perceiving it, the invitation that exists for you today is the same that existed for the people of Judah, with one difference. You are still outside the gates. There is still time to answer differently. If you desire to be reconciled with Jesus Christ because you have turned away from His ways or wish to begin now a journey toward eternal salvation, write in the comments, Lord Jesus, receive me. You are my only and sufficient Savior. And if you already belong to Him, if this story confirmed what you already know by what you have lived, write Amen in the comments and share this message. For there are people near you who need to hear this before they discover the cost of their own choice in the hardest way. The system that seduced Israel for generations never depended upon the ignorance of the people. It depended only on their continuing to choose what seemed to work. Do not let what seems to work take the place of what truly saves. Until next time.